In 1350, what we know as the idyllic French countryside was a living hell. For more than 15 years, the people had suffered at the hands of English invaders. Little did they know that this war would last for another 100 years. But through this crucible of fighting, famine and plague, there would emerge the modern nation of France. England's King Edward III looked jealously across the English Channel. Wanting France for his own, he had added the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, to his own royal standard. This was an all-out declaration of war. And in 1337, he invaded. But France already had a king, Philippe VI. As the English burned their way across the land, Philippe's army and his legendary knights marched to meet them, and came face to face with the English longbow. A simple weapon, but the most devastating the knights had ever faced. The heroes of France fell to storms of English arrows. The war engulfed the French countryside. By 1351, the conflict was focused on Brittany. One fight stands out as a spectacular display of chivalry, and a symbol of the wider conflict between the two enemy nations. The Combat of the 30 is still commemorated here in Brittany. It was a dispute between two local families. Supported by the opposing sides in the war, the French and English commanders decided to settle it through a trial of knightly combat. Each side would choose 30 champions to fight on neutral ground. France prepared to defend itself against England's finest. Intent on ending the suffering of the French peasantry, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir sent a challenge to the English commander. 30 champions on each side would compete in a tournament for final claim to Brittany. With the battleground of the Halfway Oak agreed upon, Sir Jean set out to gather support from local knights. As a knight himself, Sir Jean followed the strict rules of chivalry and was expected to protect the local peasantry and ensure peace. Triumphant, Sir Jean de Beaumanoir and his loyal knights claimed victory. The Combat of the 30 had decided control of Brittany in favor of the French. Little did the two sides know, this was just the beginning of a bitter war that would outlive them all. After victory at the Combat of the 30, the French faced devastating raids from England's Black Prince. But France's King John II was closing in. Jean finally caught the English near the city of Poitiers in September 1356. The French army outnumbered the English by thousands. King Jean himself joined the fight, but what seemed a certain victory for France soon turned into a nightmare. The English longbow devastated the mighty French army. An endless hail of arrows gutted the main French force. Then the English captured King Jean. The fight was over. The Battle of Poitiers was another catastrophic defeat for the French. The English had destroyed most of France's nobility in a single day. Now they turned their attention towards taking the French capital, Paris. The invaders marched unopposed towards Paris. The remains of some of the medieval walls of Paris still stand today. As the English army approached, the terrified locals sought shelter behind these defenses. Could France's capital withstand the full might of the Black Prince's army? The English Black Prince had raided the French countryside without mercy, and now his army had come for the capital. With the English on their doorstep, it fell to the French army and the people of Paris to defend the walls of their proud city. Hoping to avoid open battle, the French began fortifying the city, manning the walls and calling every available soldier to his post. Defeated and demoralized by the strength of the French defense, the Black Prince's army abandoned their siege of the capital. Paris celebrated victory, but this was not the last test the French would face in their struggle to win the war. The walls of Paris held out against the English onslaught. England's King Edward and the Black Prince abandoned the siege. They marched towards Chartres to try their luck at conquering a less formidable target. But before they could attack, a violent storm hit the army. Killing 1,000 English soldiers in a tempest of hail and freezing winds. To Edward, this Black Monday disaster seemed like divine retribution. A sign that it was time to stop waging war and make peace with France's King Jean. But even as peace between kings was reached, the people of France were still living in bloodshed and turmoil. Between 1358 and 1370, France was in chaos. Peasant uprisings, rampaging bands of mercenaries, and civil war ravaged the country. Peasants rose in rebellion, killing their lords and wreaking havoc. Mercenary bands also roamed the land. Known as routiers, they had once been hired by the English to fight against the French, but were cut loose when peace was reached. they systematically ravaged and pillaged towns across France. And with King Jean prisoner in England, his son Charles the Dauphin faced homegrown attacks on his rule by powerful French lords, beset from all sides. The Dauphin's forces had to regain control over their own country. Having only recently been crowned King of France, Charles V dispatched his army to the French-held village of Évreux to forge order from chaos. From here, the army would move to extinguish three major threats. Bands of roving mercenaries harrying the countryside, a peasant uprising, and attacks from a rival for the French crown, Charles of Navarre. The French army would start by reclaiming the rebel-held villages of Cocherel, Jouy, and Croissy. The French army had repelled Charles of Navarre, stemmed the revolt, and held back the raids of the Routiers. In the struggle for control over France's lands, the king still clung to power. With rebels and raiders eliminated at Cocherel, King Charles V faced one last threat to France: the relentless English invaders. Word arrived that the English army was weak and scattered, divided by infighting. The king quickly directed his army to chase down the old enemy of France at Pontvalin. The French town of Pontvalin lay directly in the path of marauding English soldiers on the hunt for loot. The town's only hope of survival lay with the French forces camped nearby. The French quickly prepared to ambush the disorganized English raiders and defend Pontvalin from ruin. After a hard-won battle against a scattered enemy, the French succeeded in halting the English chevauchée at Pontvalin. The English army was not invincible. The French cause was not yet lost. The French won an overwhelming victory at the Battle of Pontvalin. It was the first time the English had been utterly defeated during the war. But the triumph was short-lived. As England spent the next 60 years amassing French territory through alliances and victories at great battles such as Agincourt. It seemed that nothing could stop England. Who then could have foreseen that a teenaged girl was about to change the course of history? In 1429, France was in dire straits. Nowhere was it more evident than the besieged city of Orléans. The city was completely surrounded by English-held forts. But just a few days' ride away, here in Chinon, there was potential help. The French royal prince, the Dauphin Charles, was holed up in his fortress and under pressure to ride out to save Orléans. As Charles hesitated, a young peasant girl arrived at his court. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. She claimed to have received saintly visions, giving her a divine task to help Charles become king and drive the English out of France forever. Charles was skeptical, but was soon convinced of her divinity. And he charged this 17-year-old with the near impossible mission to liberate Orléans. To Jeanne, this was the first step in realizing her God-given destiny. In April 1429, she rode out from Chinon at the head of her army to confront the hated enemy of France. Surrounded by English strongholds, and with its last line of defense under attack, the city of Orléans grew ever more desperate. In France's darkest hour, 17-year-old Jeanne d'Arc arrived with the king's army to liberate a city and prevent the fall of a nation. The king's army drove the hated enemy of France from Les Tourelles. With the main road to the city back in French hands, the English abandoned their long siege of Orléans. Celebrating a momentous victory at the head of the French army, Jeanne d'Arc would forever be remembered as the Maid of Orléans. Jeanne d'Arc had liberated Orléans and put the English army to flight. However, as the English retreated, they became an obstacle for Charles the Dauphin. He needed a clear path from Chinon to Reims, where he would be crowned king. Nearing the town of Patay, the English sought to regroup. But Jeanne d'Arc and her French army were closing in. Fleeing the Loire Valley, the English were on the run. As they retreated northwards, a French vanguard was in close pursuit.
Accesmets vost, je suis votre serveuse.
After an intense pursuit and a hard-fought battle, the French crushed the remaining English army, thwarting their desperate retreat. Now the triumphant Jeanne d'Arc could safely lead Charles to Reims for his coronation as King of France. The Battle of Patay was a disaster for the English. The French wiped out their bowmen and drove their forces from the Loire Valley. Now for Jeanne d'Arc and the Dauphin, the way to Reims was clear. The Maid of Orléans rode with the Dauphin through the streets and was at his side when he was finally crowned King Charles VII of France. But less than 2 years later, Jeanne was captured in battle, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy. She spent 6 months locked in a dungeon, awaiting her fate. King Charles, who owed his crown to Jeanne, did nothing to help win her freedom. She was found guilty. On May 30th, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was brought here, to the old market square in Rouen, where she was burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. But what the Maid of Orleans started could not be denied. Her victories were the first in a chain of successes for France's military. Liberty was within reach. Thanks to the leadership of two brothers, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, the French army became experts in the use of artillery, transforming it into a disciplined, modern fighting force. In 1448, King Charles was ready to make a major move against the English. He vowed to retake Normandy. King Charles VII's army would soon have access to the most advanced artillery in Europe, thanks to the master gunners, the Bureau brothers. While the brothers developed their weapons, the king laid plans for their use. He would bring Normandy back under French control. With the English scattered and their buildings in ashes, the French had recaptured the critical fortress of Rouen. Charles VII had proven that France was no longer the underdog in the 100 Years' War. After decades of bloody dispute, Normandy was finally back in French hands. Thanks to the explosive force of cannon fire, the French were close to victory in this century-long war. But in a final grasp at power, the English dispatched a fresh army, equipped with their tried and tested longbows. Formigny would be a trial of old versus new, to determine the fate of France. English commander Sir Thomas Kyriel sent a large expedition to crush the French in Normandy. The village of Carentan was directly in their path. Massively outnumbered, the French skirmishers near Carentan would give their lives to weaken the English. Though they fought bravely, the French skirmishers could only slow the English advance. The main body of the French army finally arrived in the river valley. The French now needed to locate and destroy the English army. But they would face a well-entrenched enemy, with several local garrisons. With the last English army destroyed and the gates of Formigny thrown open, the French force in Normandy was victorious. Their well-organized forces and superior firepower had brought the arduous 100 Years' War closer to its conclusion. At Formigny, the roar of cannon fire sounded the death knell for England's ambitions in France. King Charles and the Bureau brothers did not let up on the offensive, and in 1453, the English retreated across the Channel. France was finally at peace. More than 100 years had passed since the first English chevauchés had scorched the land. The iconic French knights who fought in those early days would not have recognized their own military a century later. The English longbow, once the scourge of France, was no match for French artillery in the last years of the war. And by 1453, France's border looked very different, growing to encompass territories once claimed by England and their allies. After enduring a century of conflict, France emerged as a transformed nation. The country and its people had persevered and unified into a kingdom that could defend itself. Against all odds, France had won the 100 Years' War.